Benjamin Franklin once said, "Three men can keep a secret when two of them are dead." And many criminals have found themselves facing death sentences because their partners in crime spilt the beans. And that is the case in today's tale. This is a story of Rattlesnake James. Hi, and welcome back to the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I'm Steve, your host. I share something in common with Indiana Jones. No, not my prowess with a whip, but for an aversion to snakes. When I see them in zoos or on foreign holidays, they make me shudder. And being offered to have a photo taken with a python round my neck is a step too far for this Highland cow-loving Scotsman. History, though, is littered with stories involving snakes, and we see one in the first book of the Bible, Genesis, when the snake persuades Eve to eat fruit from the tree of knowledge. In Greek mythology, the snake-headed Medusa was one of the three Gorgons, whose stare would turn onlookers to stone. Medusa was beheaded by Perseus, who would go on to use it against the mighty Kraken. And generally, that's what people know. But Medusa, in fact, was one of the most tragic figures in Greek mythology, and that takes some doing. Medusa was originally a beautiful maiden who served in Athena's temple. When she caught the god Poseidon's eye, he wanted her and he took her against her will in the temple. This angered Athena, who, knowing she could not punish Poseidon, instead punished Medusa and transformed her into the horrid creature mythology remembers her as. Ragnar Lothbrok was a 9th century Viking leader. Whilst on a raid, he was captured by the Anglo-Saxon king Aella of Northumbria. By legend, after torture, he was killed by being thrown into a snake pit. Snakes also feature in popular literature, and where better to start than Shakespeare? In Antony and Cleopatra, Cleopatra, captured by the Romans, ends her life using a poisonous asp, sticking it onto her breast and leaving earth with these catchy last words. "With thy sharp teeth this knot intrinsicate, of life at once untie, poor venomous fool, be angry and dispatch." In the novel True Grit, the protagonist Mattie falls in a snake pit, is bitten, and eventually loses her arm. In the Harry Potter stories, beloved by many, the protagonist can, of course, converse with snakes. And of course, those superheroes with only Victorian capes, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, if they aren't shooting mad mutts in the Hound of the Baskervilles, or capturing runaway killer stallions in Silver Blaze, then they are teaching us how to batter a poisonous snake over the head in a speckled band. Honestly, it's probably a good job those two didn't have a budgie at 221 Baker Street. Of course, stories involving snakes don't just belong to mythology, legend, or literature. Off the coast in Sao Paulo in Brazil is Snake Island, a conservation island off limits to the public. This small island is 430,000 square metres, with so many snakes, there's estimated to be one for every square metre. You do the math. They feed on birds, The last human inhabitants of the island were lighthouse keepers. And like a horror film, in the 1920s, the story goes that the lighthouse keeper went out to gather wild bananas in the forest area. And one by one, the other keepers went to search and didn't come back. The lighthouse was automated after this tragedy and the realisation of just how many snakes were on the island. In 1957, Dr. Carol Schmidt was Chicago Fields Museum's herpetologist when he received a snake from Lincoln Park Zoo, which they wanted him to identify. On opening the box, he was bitten by the snake, which he was horrified to identify as a boomslang snake, to which he had no access to antivenom. The venom of the boomslang snake is a hemotoxin which disables the coagulant process, rendering the victim massive internal hemorrhaging. He knew he was going to slowly die and decided to take the heroic step to document his death in a scientific way. And his death diary makes for some pretty grim reading, with one of the entries reading 5:30 to 6:30, strong chill and shaking, followed by a fever of 101.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Bleeding of the mucous membranes in the mouth began about 5:30. And 24 hours after being bitten, Schmidt died a pretty horrific death from bleeding of his kidneys, eyes, heart, lungs, and brain. And by the way, his temperature in Celsius was 38.7. And so, on to today's story. Raymond Lizemba was born to Alabama sharecroppers in 1895. He was working life as a cotton picker when he learned he was the sole beneficiary of his uncle's $4,000 life insurance policy. He then ditched his cotton picker life and moved to Birmingham. Lizemba was always a man of very average or even below par intelligence. He was described by a childhood neighbour as less than a half-wit. And yet, he had some sort of magnetic charm to him that meant he was attractive to females. His first marriage was in 1921 when he married a woman called Maud Duncan, who ended up divorcing him on account of the fact that he demanded too kinky and sadistic sex. After this incident, somewhere between then 1924, he is believed to have changed his name to Robert S. James. Mr. James, with his new identity, moved to Kansas and married a second time, but he apparently cheated on her because she ditched him when he was threatened by a man who was the father of a pregnant young woman, allegedly impregnated by James. When his mother died, and also left her life insurance to him, a world of possibilities opened up. Life insurance fraud. He bought a life insurance policy for his nephew, and then 2 weeks later, tampered with the steering wheel in the car. His nephew, Cornelius Wright, had come to visit whilst on leave from the US Navy, and given use of the car, Wright accidentally drove it off a cliff, killing himself. A mechanic later told James that something was wrong with the steering wheel. But James, however, collected on the insurance. In 1932, he opened his own barber shop and married wife number 3, a beautiful blonde named Wyona Wallace, whom he also persuaded to buy a life insurance policy worth $14,000, making him the sole beneficiary. On their Colorado honeymoon, he hit his wife over the head with a hammer and sent her down a cliff in their car. But amazingly, she lived. But fortunately for James, she had no memory of the incident. And James, growing annoyed at her increasingly good health, picked her out of bed and drowned her in the bathtub. The death was judged subsequently to be accidental and caused by fainting, secondary to the previous head injury. James again collected the insurance money. Such a lucky man to have collected so many life insurances in such a short life. But that wasn't enough for him. After getting rich from the third wife's insurance money, he went back to Alabama and started an affair with Louise, his niece, the daughter of his sister and brother-in-law. Louise was 18 years old and was also a trained manicurist. He was able to convince her to start a barbershop in Los Angeles, and she moved there with him and continued their incestuous relationship. His greed for insurance fraud wasn't satisfied yet, and he decided to marry a fourth time and go through the usual MO. However, this time the woman he married wouldn't take a life insurance policy as she hated medical examinations. She was no use to James, so he decided to annul the marriage. In early 1935, he hired Mary, a manicurist in the barbershop, where his niece, and also his lover, worked there too. And no big surprise, did James and Mary get married. And shortly afterwards, in June 1935, Ray asked Charles Hope, one of his loyal customers who was struggling financially, to help him kill Mary for her $5,000 life insurance. And his plan for killing his wife was certainly unique. He gave Charles Hope $100 plus expenses to buy 2 rattlesnakes, which he planned to use to poison Mary. Hope brought the snakes to the James home on August the 4th, 1935, to find Mary, who was pregnant at the time but wanted an abortion. James had plied her with whiskey and bromides and strapped her unconscious Mary, who was wearing soft pink pyjamas, to the kitchen table with her eyes and mouth taped shut. James later said he managed to get his wife to cooperate by telling her a doctor was coming to perform some kind of operation on her for pregnancy. Hope then watched as Ray put Mary's foot in the box with the 2 snakes and agitated them, which led them to bite her. Hope then left the house to go return the snakes. When he returned to the home at 1:30, Hope found that Mary was still alive. He also found a drunk and outraged James. The snakes haven't done the trick, he said. Mary wasn't even sick. He had no other choice. James took her to the bathtub and drowned her. I walked in and saw this girl lying on the floor just outside the bathroom door with her pyjamas on and slippers. I carried her feet, he carried her head, and we laid her alongside the fish pond. They'd put her body by the fish pond in the backyard to attempt to make it look like an accident. Hope then left, having refused James's order to burn down the house. The subsequent autopsy showed what was appeared to be an insect bite on her left toe, but the verdict was drowning whilst intoxicated. When Mary died, it appeared another death by drowning, and the insurance investigator thought it all sounded very suspicious, and he started doing some digging. He then uncovered James's troubling patterns of behaviour, from the merry marriages to the death of his third wife, even to the death of his nephew, and the investigator tipped off police. They decided to bug his house. They heard many sexual encounters with various women, but most frequently his niece. And these sexual encounters were enough for the authorities to arrest him for incest on April the 19th, 1936. In the house on arrest, they found marriage brochures. To them, it was clear he was already in the hunt for the next victim. Readers of the Los Angeles Times read, another prize exhibit officers found in an envelope was a list of nearly 200 special feminine matrimonial prospects. Heavily underscored in the list was the name of a New York widow, 53 years of age, who advertised that she had an income $10,000 annually. A drunken Charles Hope then bragged at a bar about his involvement in Mary's murder. The bartender reported this to police and Hope was arrested. And under intense questioning, Hope told everything he knew. Hope first visited Mike Allman at the Reptile Gardens in Santa Monica. He bought 3 rattlesnakes. When presented with them, James found them to be too docile. They wouldn't do what he wanted them to do, he said. Hope returned the snake and had another conversation with Allman. Hope was told of a man who had a snake farm in Pasadena called Snake Joe, who should have exactly what he was looking for. And Hope visited the snake farm and bought 2 desert diamond rattlesnakes called Lethal and Lightning. The rattlesnakes weren't, in fact, the first attempt on Mary's life. They had procured black widow spiders, which had bitten Mary, but she had survived. On June the 2nd, 1936, Rattlesnake James, as he'd been known in the newspapers, was sentenced to 150 years on 3 moral charges. This acted as an insurance policy for the prosecution should his murder trial go horribly wrong. But they needn't have worried, as on the 25th of July, both men were found guilty of their crimes. During the trial, the snakes were brought into the courtroom by witness Snake Joe, and drama unfolded as the following account read. Lethal, one of the rattlesnakes, escaped in the courtroom during the noon recess after James had spent most of the morning in the witness stand in his own defence. Like a streak of brown quicksilver, the reptile slid under a bookcase. His vicious rattling threw the courtroom into hysteria. Snake Joe and another rattlesnake man came to the rescue and captured Lethal before he could bite anyone. Hope had turned state's witness in order to avoid a death sentence. James subsequently received the death sentence, and Hope life in prison. And on May the 2nd, 1942, an article in the Los Angeles Times read as the following. Robert S. James, 48 years old, rattlesnake killer, mounted the 13 steps to the hangman's noose and death in the San Quentin gallows today. With Charles Hope, ex-sailor and hot dog stand operator, as his accomplice, he'd bound his bride of 3 months to a breakfast table, taped her mouth and eyes, and then thrust her bare leg into a box containing 2 diamond-backed rattlesnakes. His conviction was upheld twice by the state Supreme Court and once by the United States Supreme Court. In the years he spent on San Quentin's condemned row, James became very religious, and the other convicts called him Holy Joe. He willed his possessions to his sister, Mrs. Eva Murphy of Birmingham, who claimed his body. And that was the story of Rattlesnake James. But what wasn't mentioned in the newspaper report was that the rope was the wrong length and Jones strangled for 10 minutes. And it was described as the following, and makes for some horrifying reading for some, or poetic justice for others. Clinton Duffy was the warden, and he later described the execution. Quote, the man hit bottom. I observed that he was fighting by pulling on the straps, wheezing, whistling, trying to get air, that blood was oozing through the black cat. I observed also that he urinated, defecated, and the droppings fell on the floor, and the stench was terrible. I also saw witnesses pass out and have to be carried from the witness room. Some of them threw up. It took 10 minutes for the condemned man to die. When he was taken down and the cat removed, big hunks of flesh were torn off the side of his face where the noose had been. His eyes were popped and his tongue was swollen and hanging from his mouth. His face had turned purple. Rattlesnake James was the last man to be hanged in California before it turned to the gas chamber as a means of execution. California executed 307 men by hanging between 1893 and 1942, 215 at San Quentin, and 92 at Folsom Prison. Well, that's it for another episode of the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I hope you enjoyed that one, and I hope it wasn't too graphic. And, as always, like, subscribe, and if you haven't left a review, please do, and recommend me to your friends and family. And, until next time, bye-bye.